In the opulent heart of Manhattan, where towering skyscrapers kissed the heavens and the streets buzzed with the constant hum of life, there lived an extraordinary woman. Evelyn Kensington, at the age of 75, was not just any elderly lady, she was a force to be reckoned with. Born into a world of privilege, she had inherited her immense fortune from her late husband, Richard Kensington, an industrial magnate who had dominated the steel industry for decades. Richard had died tragically in a plane crash when Evelyn was 50, leaving her as the sole custodian of the Kensington legacy. For over 2 decades, Evelyn had maintained her status as one of New York's most influential figures. Her wealth was vast, her power undeniable. She owned properties across the globe, controlled numerous charitable foundations, and was a regular fixture at high society events. Despite her age, Evelyn remained strikingly beautiful, with silver hair that framed her sharp features and piercing blue eyes that seemed to see through everyone and everything. Yet, for all her wealth and influence, Evelyn was a profoundly lonely woman. The grand halls of her Fifth Avenue mansion echoed with silence, a stark contrast to the lively soirees she once hosted with Richard by her side. The loneliness was a constant companion, gnawing at her as she sat in her expansive library or walked through the manicured gardens. She had no children to fill the void left by her husband's death, and though she had countless acquaintances, there was no one she could truly call a friend. It was during one of these lonely afternoons, as she sat sipping tea in her sunlit drawing room, that Evelyn first laid eyes on Daniel Moore. He was 24, tall and handsome, with dark hair that curled slightly at the ends and eyes that sparkled with a mischievous light. Daniel was a struggling artist, or so he claimed, trying to make a name for himself in the cutthroat world of New York's art scene. He had been introduced to Evelyn at a charity auction, where one of his paintings was being sold to raise funds for the Kensington Foundation. Evelyn was immediately captivated by him. There was something about Daniel's carefree attitude, his easy smile, and the way he looked at her, not with the awe or fear that most people did, but with genuine curiosity. It had been years since anyone had looked at her like that, and it stirred something deep within her. She found herself drawn to his youth, his vitality, and the promise of adventure that seemed to follow him wherever he went. Daniel, for his part, saw in Evelyn an opportunity he could not pass up. He had been living on the edge, barely making ends meet, and the idea of being taken under the wing of one of New York's wealthiest women was too tempting to resist. He played his role to perfection, flattering Evelyn, listening intently to her stories, and making her feel alive in a way she hadn't felt in years. He showered her with attention, made her laugh, and slowly but surely, he wormed his way into her heart. Before long, Evelyn had invited Daniel to move into her mansion. She offered him a luxurious guest suite, access to her wealth, and the kind of life he had always dreamed of. In return, all she asked was his companionship. Daniel accepted eagerly, and soon they were inseparable. He accompanied her to social events, dined with her in the finest restaurants, and even traveled with her to Europe on lavish vacations. For a while, it seemed like a perfect arrangement. Evelyn had finally found someone to share her life with, someone who made her feel young again. Daniel, in turn, enjoyed the spoils of Evelyn's wealth, designer clothes, expensive cars, and a lifestyle that was worlds away from his humble beginnings. But beneath the surface, cracks were beginning to form. Chapter 2. The Temptation of Youth. As much as Daniel enjoyed the benefits of his relationship with Evelyn, he couldn't help but feel suffocated. The mansion, with its gilded ceilings and priceless artworks, began to feel like a gilded cage. He missed the freedom of his old life, the nights spent drinking with friends, the thrill of the unknown. Evelyn, for all her wealth and charm, was still an old woman, and Daniel was a young man with desires and ambitions that she could never fulfill. It was during one of his many nights out, under the pretense of attending an art show, that Daniel met Lily Thompson. Lily was everything Evelyn was not, young, vibrant, and full of life. She was 21, a waitress at a trendy downtown bar, with auburn hair that fell in soft waves and green eyes that sparkled with mischief. Lily had dreams of her own, but for now, she was content with living in the moment, enjoying the city's nightlife and the company of interesting people. Daniel was instantly smitten. There was something about Lily's carefree attitude, her infectious laugh, and the way she made him feel like he was the only man in the world. They began seeing each other regularly, meeting in secret at Lily's small apartment in Brooklyn or in out-of-the-way cafes where no one would recognize them. Daniel kept his relationship with Evelyn hidden, telling Lily that he was an artist struggling to make it in the big city, that he lived in a shared loft with other artists, and that he was just biding his time until his big break came. Lily, naive and trusting, believed every word. She fell for Daniel hard and fast, drawn to his good looks and the air of mystery that surrounded him. She had no idea that the man she was falling in love with was living a double life, that he was already involved with a woman old enough to be his grandmother. And Daniel, intoxicated by the thrill of the affair, found himself growing more and more distant from Evelyn. Evelyn, however, was not as oblivious as Daniel thought. She had lived long enough, seen enough of the world, to recognize the signs. Daniel was coming home later and later, his excuses growing thinner with each passing day. He had become secretive, guarding his phone closely, and there were times when she caught a strange look in his eyes, as if he were somewhere else entirely. The first time she suspected he might be seeing someone else, she dismissed it as paranoia. But the signs became too numerous to ignore, and Evelyn's suspicions grew into a dark, gnawing certainty. She decided to confront him, but not directly. Evelyn Kensington was not one to act on impulse. She needed proof, something tangible that would confirm her worst fears. And so, she hired a private investigator, a discreet man with a reputation for uncovering the truth, no matter how well hidden it might be. The investigator shadowed Daniel for weeks, documenting his every move, every meeting, every phone call. What he discovered was worse than Evelyn had imagined. The investigator presented Evelyn with a dossier filled with photographs and reports. There were pictures of Daniel and Lily, holding hands as they walked through Central Park, kissing in the dim light of a cozy cafe, entering Lily's apartment late at night and not leaving until the early hours of the morning. There were records of their phone conversations, texts filled with declarations of love and plans for a future that did not include Evelyn. As Evelyn flipped through the pages, her hands trembling with a mixture of anger and despair, the reality of the situation settled over her like a suffocating blanket. She had been betrayed, not just by Daniel, but by her own heart. She had allowed herself to be vulnerable, to believe that someone like Daniel could ever truly love her, and now she was paying the price. But Evelyn was not a woman to be taken lightly. She had built her life on strength, on control, and she would not let Daniel or his little girlfriend ruin everything she had worked for. Her mind began to race, calculating, planning. She knew what she had to do. Chapter 3. A Web of Deception. Daniel's double life continued, unaware that Evelyn was now fully aware of his betrayal. He spent his days with Evelyn, playing the role of the devoted companion, and his nights with Lily, losing himself in the passion of their forbidden affair. But as the days turned into weeks and the weeks into months, Daniel began to notice a change in Evelyn. She had become more distant, more reserved. There was a coldness in her eyes that hadn't been there before, and he couldn't shake the feeling that she was watching him, waiting for him to slip up. One evening, Evelyn invited Daniel to a private dinner at the mansion. She told him it was to celebrate a new investment that had paid off handsomely, and Daniel, always eager to keep up appearances, agreed. When he arrived, the mansion was eerily quiet. The staff had been given the night off, and the usual warmth that greeted him was absent. Evelyn met him in the grand dining room, where a table had been set for two, adorned with crystal glasses and fine china. Candles flickered softly, casting long shadows on the walls. Evelyn, dressed in a flowing black gown, looked every bit the queen of her domain. She smiled at Daniel, but it didn't reach her eyes. As they sat down to eat, Evelyn made small talk, asking Daniel about his day, his art, and his plans for the future. Daniel answered her questions, but there was a growing unease in the pit of his stomach. Something was off, but he couldn't quite put his finger on it. Halfway through the meal, Evelyn reached for a bottle of wine and poured them both a glass. She raised her glass in a toast, her voice smooth and controlled. "To new beginnings," she said, her eyes locked on Daniel's. He hesitated for a moment before clinking his glass against hers. As they drank, Evelyn watched him closely. Daniel barely tasted the wine, his mind too preoccupied with trying to decipher Evelyn's behavior. When the glass was empty, Evelyn placed it down carefully and leaned back in her chair. "I know about her, Daniel," she said, her voice quiet but firm. Daniel froze, his heart skipping a beat. "I don't know what you're talking about," he stammered, but the lie was weak, and they both knew it. Evelyn smiled, a slow, predatory smile. "Don't insult me, Daniel. I know everything. About Lily, about your little affair, about the lies you've been feeding me for months." Daniel's mind raced, trying to come up with an excuse, a way out of this nightmare. But Evelyn wasn't finished. "You thought you could play me, didn't you? Take my money, my trust, and run off with that little tramp? Did you really think I wouldn't find out?" Her voice was calm, but there was an edge to it that made Daniel's blood run cold. He tried to speak, to apologize, to beg for forgiveness, but the words wouldn't come. Evelyn stood up, her movements slow and deliberate. She walked over to the fireplace and picked up a small remote. With the press of a button, the room was filled with the sound of a soft click, and the large painting above the mantel slid aside to reveal a screen. On the screen were the photos, the texts, the evidence of Daniel's betrayal. Evelyn had set a trap and Daniel had walked right into it. He watched in horror as his secret life was laid bare before him, the images flashing by like a slow-motion car crash. Evelyn turned to face him, her expression unreadable. "You've made a fool of me, Daniel, and for that you will pay." Panic surged through Daniel. He stood up, backing away from the table, but Evelyn was faster. She pressed another button and the doors to the dining room locked with a loud click. There was no escape. "You're not going anywhere, Daniel," she said, her voice cold as ice. "You belong to me, and if I can't have you, no one can." Daniel's world spun as he realized the full extent of Evelyn's wrath. He had underestimated her, and now he was trapped in a nightmare of his own making. Evelyn moved toward him, her eyes gleaming with a deadly calm. Chapter 4: The Final Act. The hours that followed were a blur of terror and desperation for Daniel. Evelyn's carefully constructed plan unfolded with chilling precision. She had drugged the wine, just enough to make him compliant, but not enough to knock him out completely. As he sat slumped in his chair, his limbs heavy and uncooperative, Evelyn began to lay out her final act of vengeance. She spoke to him in a soft, almost tender tone, recounting every detail of his betrayal, every moment of his deception. She told him how she had trusted him, how she had let him into her life, into her heart, only to be repaid with lies and deceit. And now, she was going to make sure he felt every ounce of the pain he had caused her. Evelyn produced a small, ornate box from a drawer. Inside were several vials of a clear liquid. "Do you know what this is, Daniel?" she asked, holding up one of the vials. "It's a paralytic, very powerful, very effective. You won't be able to move, but you'll be fully aware of everything that happens." Daniel's eyes widened in fear as she drew the liquid into a syringe. He tried to protest, to plead for his life, but his words came out as a slurred, incoherent mess. Evelyn approached him calmly, as if she were administering a routine injection. The needle pricked his skin, and within moments, Daniel felt his body go completely limp. The paralysis took hold, and Daniel was left powerless, trapped in his own body. His mind raced, panic clawing at the edges of his consciousness, but there was nothing he could do. Evelyn stood over him, her expression one of cold satisfaction. "You'll stay like this for a few hours," she said, placing the syringe back in the box. "Plenty of time for me to take care of a few things." Evelyn left the room, leaving Daniel alone with his thoughts. He could hear the faint sounds of her movements elsewhere in the mansion, but his mind was too clouded to piece together what she was doing. Time stretched on, each minute feeling like an eternity as Daniel's terror mounted. When Evelyn finally returned, she was dressed in a simple black coat, her hair pulled back into a tight bun. She moved about the room, gathering a few items, a small suitcase, a set of keys, and a gun. Daniel's eyes followed her every move, his mind screaming in silent horror. Evelyn approached him one last time, her gaze unwavering. "I'm leaving, Daniel," she said quietly, "but don't worry, you won't be alone for long." She bent down and kissed his forehead, a gesture that might have seemed tender if it weren't for the cold detachment in her eyes. Then she turned and walked out of the room, leaving Daniel to his fate. For what felt like hours, Daniel lay there, helpless and terrified, as the paralysis slowly began to wear off. But even as his muscles started to respond again, he knew it was too late. Evelyn had left him to die, alone and abandoned in the grand mansion that had once been his prison. Chapter 5: The aftermath. The discovery of Daniel's body made headlines across the country. The once charming young man found lifeless in the mansion of a reclusive heiress. It was a story too scandalous to ignore. The media painted Evelyn as a villain, a woman driven to madness by jealousy and betrayal. But as the days passed, it became clear that Evelyn Kensington had planned her escape down to the last detail. There was no trace of her anywhere. The mansion was left in perfect order, no sign of a struggle, no evidence that could link her to Daniel's death. She had vanished without a trace, leaving behind only the whispered rumors and unanswered questions. Lily Thompson was never found. She had simply disappeared, her life snuffed out like a candle in the wind. Her friends and family were left to mourn her in silence, never knowing the truth about what had happened to her. And Evelyn? She had slipped away into the shadows, a ghost in the night. Some said she had fled to Europe, where she would live out the rest of her days in luxury. Others believed she had gone somewhere remote, far from the reach of the law, where she could finally be free. But wherever she went, Evelyn Kensington would always be remembered as the woman who had everything and lost it all in a fit of rage and revenge. A woman who had loved too deeply and paid the ultimate price for that love. And so, the story of Evelyn Kensington, Daniel Moore, and Lily Thompson became a cautionary tale, a reminder of the dangers of desire, deceit, and the dark side of the human heart.